So one of the topics I've certainly brought up quite a few times has to do with just simply Democratic voter registration. And it has been in a consistent downward trend, arguably now for 5 years. And what's been a head scratcher has been the sort of at times what has appeared as a lack of urgency among some party leaders about this trend line registration. And it turned out that what the Republicans did, starting in arguably before the 2020 election, but certainly, and maybe this is about COVID, and with my guest here, we're going to talk about that a little bit, is how much this initial setback was during COVID, when the Republicans were more comfortable doing in person than the Democrats were. But the fact is, we're here. There was one, I believe the folks over at Decision Desk put out a stat that showed, I think in the last year, Democrats have lost 1 million registered voters among the states that keep track of that. Republicans have lost about 100,000. And of course, no party or independent, whatever the delineation is by state, is where all these extra voters have come. Tom Bonier is a longtime Democratic strategist, former CEO of TargetSmart, the chief voter file company for Team Blue. These days, when I was at NBC, we actually worked with TargetSmart as well. And in fact, our NBC poll combines TargetSmart work with one of the key voter file companies on Team Red. And Tom Bonier in a New York Times interview goes, "Hey, I was dismissive of these voter registration numbers, and I was wrong." He's here today to talk more about that. Tom, good to see you.
Good to be here.
So let's start with this. Where did this begin? Because, for essentially the first 15 years of this century, Democrats were making the registration progress, right? Barack Obama's campaign and sort of the success of his administration. And that's sort of if you look at an overall 50-year trend, if you have a two-term president, it does usually help your party in the voter registration column. But they hit a wall somewhere. And the question was, why did it happen? It started with COVID, but where has it gone? And how have you come to the conclusion that this turned out to be something we should have focused more on?
Yeah, I mean, you could actually even put the start of it even further back, potentially to 2017, when you saw. Now, it had a different impact at that point in terms of Trump's first term, but the Democratic Party brand after the Bernie Clinton primary wasn't great, and so what you saw at that point, starting in 2017 and going forward, was fewer people registering or identifying as Democrats, but it wasn't really impacting the vote at that point because of the negative reaction to Trump's first term. There was a lot of enthusiasm, especially among younger voters going into the 2018 midterms. So these voters were registering as unaffiliated voters, but were still voting for Democrats. And so you're right. It was more around the pandemic in 2020, where initially you saw a bigger drop in terms of the percent of registered voters in states that have partisan registration, which is more than half the states. And it's a very diverse sample of states in terms of red states, blue states, purple states. You saw that number dropping even more, but it was spiky then because you remember the Black Lives Matter movement, and after George Floyd's murder, you saw where there was more organizing happen, generally driven by that movement. You did see some more spikes in Democratic registration leading into that election. So if you want to see where it really went south for Democrats, it was generally just during that 4-year period of President Biden's presidency, where it followed the polling numbers. Again, the Democratic Party brand was heading south. And what we saw, and you mentioned that quote I had in the New York Times about being wrong. What I was, very specifically wrong about was this calculation that, well, maybe it's okay. Maybe that, what we saw during Trump's first term is something we would see repeated, that while fewer people were identifying with the party or registering, more importantly, with the party, that you looked at these unaffiliated voters and they looked more like Democratic voters, meaning they were younger, they were more women than men, they were color. And in the end, that didn't bear out. These are exactly the voters that President Trump overperformed with in this year's election.
So let's start with just the mechanics of voter registration. You could argue that a political party has one job: get members, right? Like that ultimately you have one job particularly if you run a county party or a state party. national party, you could argue, is sort of in some ways making sure you have healthy chapters, right, all over the country. But certainly on a state and local level, you have one job. I'm a Floridian, a former Floridian, and I have marveled at the incompetency of the state Democratic Party, because the voters have performed better. Like, for the longest time, Democrats used to overperform their organization. And it would be one of those things, boy, if you ever actually spent some money on organization, this could happen. And then everything went in the reverse. And the Republicans just simply made a concerted effort to register voters. And the Democratic Party didn't. And I've never, what is in the, why isn't this first and foremost, why do Democrats outsource this more, it appears, than the Republicans do?
Yeah, well, this is a complicated one, and you hit on some of the key elements of this. And Democrats have invested in voter registration, to your point, generally not through the party. There are some reasons just in terms of the type of money you can spend. For the longest time, Democrats had organizations like Acorn that no longer exist, that were very successful in registering voters.
It's all they did, right? They had one job, right? It's
nonpartisan work. So what that generally means, or overwhelmingly nonpartisan work, meaning the
less partisan work is in legal terms, it's nonpartisan, right?
So 501c3, generally a lot of these organizations are registered as 501c3s or 501c4s, meaning that they can't go out and say, are you a Democrat or a Republican, and then only register the Democrats. It's not partisan registration. So they would register people based on demographics. So they would go to college campuses. They would go to neighborhoods
where you would get a larger share of who you're registering, but it's not like they wouldn't register somebody that wanted to be a Republican, a Libertarian, or Green Party, whatever, right?
It was simple math that if you were getting more people on one side than another, it generally worked out fine. And again, that was something that worked well for Democrats. And again, it was this calculus that, well, in the end, it doesn't matter if they self-identify or identify in that voter registration card as a Democrat, as long as they're voting for and with the party. And for the longest time, that was a calculus that was okay. And I should point out, even when you look at the last 4 years or even last year, there were Democratic or progressive entities that did overwhelmingly nonpartisan voter registration that were still getting results. But the problem was, with the lack of the partisan element, with a lack of investment in partisan voter registration, the margins weren't nearly where they were in the past. And what's striking to me, if you want to look at the impact of this, I looked at turnout just in terms of partisan registration across the battleground states. Now, 4 of the 7 battleground states offer partisan registration, so it's not all of them, but again, a pretty good sample. The differential in turnout, if you compare 2020, where Joe Biden won, and 2024, where Donald Trump won, the differential in turnout between Democrats and Republicans 2024 to 2020 was less than a point. I mean, the swing was minimal, but the deciding factor and why the result ended up being this landslide from an electoral college perspective for Donald Trump was because there were just so many more registered Republicans in 2024 and fewer, to the point you made earlier. It wasn't just that the Democratic numbers were stagnant. There were actually fewer registered Democrats. So Democrats going into this election, in order to win, would have had to have gotten higher turnout among partisan Democrats than they got in 2020, which was almost impossible. We think that 2020 had record-setting turnout, and Democrats did quite well in turnout. For Vice President Harris to accomplish that would have been incredibly difficult.
Have you examined the Republican tactics and because they do it more in a more partisan basis than the Democratic side? Is there something to be learned?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that I'm, can dig into it and that it's out there, and a lot of it is out there in the public. I think they've been very proud of what they especially in states like Pennsylvania.
Look, arguably, it is all they thought about starting in 2017 was, we can't, it was like, it reminded me of Karl Rove after 2000. Hey, I don't want to have a margin like that again. Let's try to improve in all of these key battleground states. And back then it was Florida and Ohio. This time it was the big 3, but particularly with Pennsylvania.
Well, that's right. I mean, when you look at their postmortem after the 2012 election, where they said, look, we're not going to win another national election if we continue to do as poorly as we do with these emerging demographics, especially younger voters and voters of color. And then they didn't really do anything about it.
Ironically, the autopsy was right. They just didn't know Donald Trump was the answer.
Exactly.
That was going to win him over a more diverse. I mean, it is a strange thing now. I didn't mean to sort of interrupt your train of thought, but I've thought about that autopsy. So were they right? It just they were wrong about who the right person was. I mean, anyway. But I digress.
Just at the time, I don't think, nor would they.
I don't think that's what Right Sweepers had in mind. No.
No, certainly not. And so when you look at their actual tactics now, a lot of it looks a lot like what Democrats were doing again a decade ago, 2 decades ago, especially, the successful efforts of the Obama campaign. We have to remember that the Obama campaign in 2008, they're organizing with younger voters was something a lot of people looked at it and said, well, look, these younger voters don't vote, even especially not in presidential primary elections. And that campaign saw an opportunity there. And they put not only their candidate there, but their resources organizing on college campuses. It's arguably what won them the primary and then carried through to the general election. And Republicans, in a lot of ways, followed that model where they just had a presence on college campuses that generally would be thought of as quite hostile, but for Republican electeds, for Republican candidates. But what they recognized, I think accurately, was that it wasn't a matter of they didn't need to win these areas. They just needed to turn around the numbers enough. They needed to not get out among younger voters. And you look at what they've created there, it's incredible, especially among younger men. And these are numbers that are holding still. They're resilient, especially among young men. When we look at President Trump's overall numbers, frankly, in the toilet at the moment, they're still out registering Democrats among younger men.
I have a thesis on that it's COVID. I have a Gen Z focus group in my household, 2 college students. And my younger one was sort of, let me put it this way. He and his friends, I would say, think about this. Your first interaction with government is COVID. And for some of these guys, right, the first time they've dealt with government, it took them away from their friends. And I think I think this is going to be a generational thing with these guys. But we'll see, right? It's only one cycle, but that's just a thesis I have, that this is more COVID related than we fully appreciate.
I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, I shared, generally a lot of the things that I will share, I would say most of the things I share as a partisan Democrat that I share in public are going to appear to be more favorable for Democrats. But in November of 2023, I shared some analysis that I put together that was looking at the voter registration gender gap among voters under the age of 25. And it was really, for me, sounding the alarm, where among all of the party registration states, the gender gap among these younger voters was 26 points. In Pennsylvania, it was almost 37 points. And to me, that was a flashing red alarm, that's something that if that's something that holds and that we don't do something about it, we're not going to win. And I think to your point, it certainly came out of COVID. These were, it's complex, but when you put these younger men, especially in a situation where suddenly their lives are being lived almost entirely online, in the sort of interactions they were having and the connections they were making, and then sort of the lack of real world connections they had, I think it had a massive impact. When you look at the Navigator surveys from after the election, which is a great data set of large sample size post-election surveys, they asked the question about how much political news do you consume? And there's a straight line correlation between the answer to that question and for whom you voted, meaning the people who say I consume a lot of political news, Vice President Harris won by 6 points. But those who say that I consume no or almost none, Donald Trump won by almost 15 points. And again, we talk about these voters as low information voters. They're overwhelmingly younger, and they were more men than women. We talk about them as low information voters. They're not exactly low information voters. They're consuming so much information, but they aren't consuming overt political information in the spaces that Democrats generally were contesting or communicating in.
Have you studied this? It does feel as if, sort of how often is it like when you register somebody for the first time for your party, what kind of stickiness is that? Is that a 10-year stick? Is that a generational stick? Is that like, have you looked at this through generational prisms? It's fascinating to me that my generation's the most pro-Trump generation, Gen X. And I attribute it to growing up Reagan, as I call it, right? That was our formative years were Reagan, right? That was the president during when we were both from, you had Nancy Reagan showing up on different strokes. And then, it was just sort of, it was and economy was pretty good, right? It was in the end of the Cold War, right? We won something. So that's my explanation for it. But I have no idea whether I'm just sort of going through my head and sort of saying, well, how much is that early commitment to a party matter long term?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. And the phenomena that you mentioned, or the theory that you just posited, is actually something the political scientists have studied and shown that who is present when you're in those formative years. And again, it'll depend for the individual in terms of when tuning into these things. But people talk about broadly the culture, which is somewhat nebulous. But certainly Ronald Reagan in the 80s, as a member of Gen X myself, it was ubiquitous from a cultural perspective. So the biggest impact is your household composition in a lot of ways as well, or at least maybe next in line between that phenomena.
So what your parents are.
What your parents are has a huge impact. Now, I'll be curious to see if that holds. It would suggest that maybe now that's less sticky. But wherever, to your original question, when someone registers with a party, they tend to stay there, and it takes time. Generally, they'll start voting the other way before they switch. And so we talk about these ancestral Democrats in places like West Virginia, throughout Appalachia, let's just say. Kentucky.
That's the last spot of the generational Democrats is Appalachia, right? It's like Kentucky, West Virginia. It's like the last Southern Ohio. I don't feel like you have it in the Deep South anymore.
You don't. No, they're gone. They're gone at this point, and they are going, Pennsylvania actually produces data on party switchers on a very regular basis, and you see it still happening
and it's all Appalachia-like areas, like Western PA. Yeah.
No, that's right. And Pennsylvania is fascinating to me because, again, you mentioned the success the Republicans had. They had massive investment in partisan registration there, not just in 2024, but going back 4 or 5 years before that with great success. What's interesting to me is if you look at this moment now, they have some court races there that maybe aren't getting a lot of attention nationally, but are in Pennsylvania and are incredibly important in a lot of ways. And Democrats are actually doing, among new registrants, are actually doing better than they did 4 and even 8 years ago. So it's something that I'm looking at. They're not doing much better, but they're doing a point or two better, which is this a bit of a turnaround? I don't know. But
is it Shapiro related? I mean, he's a popular governor.
Right. That's a big part of it. But an important point here is even with that happening, the net numbers are still getting worse for Democrats. Part of it is because of who is being removed from the file, to put it in a fast way, which part of that is deaths. Part of that is people moving out of the states. Part of that is purging. But that's generally negative. The people who are in their 80s are actually more Democratic than not. People who get purged off the file tend to be more Democrats. So Republicans are still actually gaining in the net there, even while Democrats are doing better among new registrants. So another thing to keep an eye on.
In 2012, after that election, and I feel like the most prominent person making this argument was Tom Bevan over at Real Clear, that there was a missing white vote, that there was this chunk of people not voting. And that was the explanation for why Romney so underperformed, particularly in certain places. I was a bit skeptical, and I think some people were. And then 2016 happened, and then 2020 happened, and 2024 happened. And you can't help but wonder how much of the Trump gain is missing is voters that weren't participating, say, in the first 12 years of this century versus those that switched.
Yeah. It's a big part of it. I mean, obviously, the entire equation has changed so radically from 2012 that it's hard to point to one thing, right? Because we've seen that these voters who were more consistent voting, better educated, again, traditionally Republican voters voted for Romney in 2012, voted for McCain in 2008.
Tom, I live in the last Romney precinct of Arlington, as I call it.
There you go.
Right. And they haven't voted Republican since in this area.
Right. And so there's,
I wouldn't call them liberal Democrats.
No, by no means. But those voters have voted. They likely voted for Clinton. They almost certainly voted for Biden and for Harris. These are the voters who are voting in these lower turnout elections. It's the reason why. It's been fairly well documented. The Democrats are doing better in these lower turnout, especially these special elections. It used to be the great advantage for Republicans, and that has turned on its head. And so, yeah, there are more of these lower turnout white voters who are coming out when Trump is on the ballot. They didn't come out in 2018.
Right.
Not enough of them came out in 2022 to have a red wave election. We'll see what happens this year in New Jersey and in Virginia and Pennsylvania and other places. See what happens next year. But the other element of this that we've been talking about is Republican improvements among younger voters, especially younger voters of color and younger white men. And so I don't know that you can count those in terms of the missing white vote. Sure, these are voters who demographically generally would be a smaller share of the electorate and now have been ascendant under Trump. I will say, when you look at the polling numbers now and you look at what drives Trump's, reasonably good numbers when he was elected and when he was inaugurated to where they quickly went, the voters who dropped the most were these same voters who swung the most towards him. So these younger voters now have overwhelmingly negative numbers. But like I said a few minutes ago, when you look at the partisan registration, younger white men are still registering overwhelmingly Republican, which tells me Republicans are doing the nuts and bolts, blocking and tackling work of doing the registration at the local level and holding on to some of those margins.
If the Democratic Party pointed to one thing, do they have a base problem or a persuasion problem?
Well, look, time will tell. I mean, from both perspectives, I think Democrats feel better about where they are now in terms of Trump's popularity. But I think there's two parts to this equation, right? There's how well will Democrats do in the elections happening next month and then the elections next year, just based on an anti-Trump, anti-Republican sentiment, which history would tell us, and we don't have to go back any further than 2018, but historically we could go back as far as we want and find Democrats should do quite well in these elections just because of anti-incumbency, and especially because of Trump and his low popularity numbers. To me, the big question is, are Democrats able to connect the dots and give voters a reason to vote for them from the positive case? Can we get to the point where people feel better about the Democratic Party, where more people are associating and affiliating with the Democratic Party? Why I'm watching these voter registration numbers so closely now, because that's where you would expect to see it first before the election, is more people when they go, maybe it's just they're getting their driver's license. Maybe it's not even efforted voter registration, but they have a few boxes they could check. And right now, those younger voters are overwhelmingly just saying unaffiliated, just as they did a year ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And so for Democrats to really be able to maximize their potential in these upcoming elections, I think that's where you're going to see it, is them being able to build that positive case. And so to me, that's it's both. It's persuasion and mobilization. It's persuading the people to get to the point where they enter that mobilization category where they're going to be turnout targets for Democratic campaigns.
There's a reason results matter more than promises. Just like there's a reason Morgan & Morgan has become America's largest injury law firm. For the last 35 years, they've recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. It includes cases where insurance companies offered next to nothing, short of shortchanging, seeing if they could get away with it. And Morgan & Morgan fought back, and they won millions. In Pennsylvania, one client was awarded $26 million. It was a staggering 40 times the amount that the insurance company originally offered. That offer, $650,000, whatever it took to sort of get away without paying. So with more than 1,000 lawyers across the country, Morgan & Morgan knows how to deliver for everyday people. So if you're injured, you're looking for a lawyer, check out forthepeople.com/Toddcast or dial pound law, pound 529 on your cell phone. And remember, all law firms are not the same. So give Morgan & Morgan a look. Their fee is free unless they win. Do you think the Democrats are resting, almost counting too much on Trump voters not showing up when Trump's not on the ballot? Like it's sort of like I hear this talk all the time. Well, Democrats will be fine, and it may actually be a reason to sort of be careful thinking 26, if it goes well for Democrats, is somehow a harbinger for 28, considering if quote unquote the Trump voter just simply doesn't show up again for midterms. They know this too, right? They know they have this problem, and it does sound as if they're going to make more of an effort to see if they can get these voters more engaged in elections that don't involve Trump. Do you sense? Let me tell you what I sense, that Democrats are almost counting on this phenomenon, and I would be weary of counting on the phenomenon given how much money they're throwing at this.
Yeah, look, that's a hard one to read in terms of what's happening tactically on the ground. I do think that, again, based on the history, you're right. The Democrats are looking at this and making a calculus that in the end, historically, these voters haven't come out when Donald Trump is not on the ballot. So therefore, we should do better. And, the special elections so far have proven that true.
But they look everything looks similar to 2017.
That's right.
Except the Democratic Party's unfavorable rating.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
like if that's the one thing that's different, it's much higher. Yeah.
That's right. And that's why I think, obviously Democrats have been going very hard on healthcare during this shutdown. And that to me tells me that they are making an effort to appeal not just to the mobilization universe, not that the audience doesn't want to hear that message, but to those swing voters. I mean, when they have a message that Marjorie Taylor Greene is agreeing with, suggests there's something there, and there's an opportunity and an effort to appeal to these swing voters who likely voted for Trump last year, but are potentially part of that, maybe 15% of the country who voted for him, felt favorably about him when he took office, and don't feel that way now.
When you hear Democrats have a brand problem, what is it that the problem is? That people don't know what the party does stand for, or that people do know what the party stands for and they don't like it? How do you view the quote brand problem? Is it just not very well defined, or frankly defined in an unpopular way?
Look, I'm a numbers guy. I'm not a policy or a messaging guy. But when you look at the numbers from the 2024 election, again, you look at the exit polls, you look at the Navigator survey, there was a big problem in terms of awareness of issues. You looked at sort of the four signature legislative accomplishments of President Biden and Democrats while he was in. And in each of those, and Navigator tested this, a majority, in some cases, over 60% of Americans said they didn't know anything about them. And then a real kick in the pants for Democrats. More independent voters said that Donald Trump did more on infrastructure when in office than Joe Biden did.
So just by saying infrastructure week, even though it failed, it stuck.
So in our very online circles, that was a meme, right? That was a running joke that, it's infrastructure.
Right. And yet it turned out people have thought, that Donald Trump cares about infrastructure.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's what bubble.
Can't make it up.
The other side.
So you believe it is it's an awareness. So it's more message penetration. The message itself might be working if they knew how to. This would be a marketing problem as much as you may have a good brand, but if you don't market it correctly, nobody knows your brand is good.
I think there's two ways to look at this question. One is the previous 4 years when Democrats were in power, or at least in the White House, and then there's the question of now where Democrats don't control anything. And I think there's that has always been a challenge for the party that is out of power. And how do you define your own proactive agenda? I mean, we can go back to 1934 and the contract with America and Newt Gingrich, and how Republicans successfully were able to brand some type of actual agenda. I think that's a lot more challenging in the issue environment and just the media consumption environment we're in now to get voters to pay attention to these things. I think the shutdown, again, when you see Democrats talking more specifically about healthcare, is a good step in that direction. I just think it's much more challenging these days to get that proactive, positive message out there, an agenda out there, when in the end, Democrats don't have the ability to really move any of this forward.
All right, I want to geek out, do geek out on some states. And so, there's, you look at the 7 swing states. And is it in your head a hard 7? meaning you got the three Midwestern states, right? Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Then you got the Sun Belt states of Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina. Is 8 closer to 7, i.e. New Hampshire, or is 8 closer to 9? You see what I mean? Is it those 7 and everybody else? Or do you think there's a couple other states still sort of, on the outside looking in, they could jump into the battleground map?
Yeah, if you wanted to look at obviously the map and where states were moving in 2024 relative to 2020, you had a handful of states that I think you would have a very strong argument for saying, they shouldn't be considered swing states in any sense, but they were getting closer. New Hampshire was one of them. You had Minnesota. Look, even
Minnesota's been sitting there on the cusp. I view Minnesota the way I view New Jersey for Republicans. It's always close, but Charlie Brown, Lucy always pulls the football.
Well, and for them, it'd be their, 340th electoral vote. It's not really relevant from a strategic perspective.
Right.
And so, no, I think at this point, the 7 states are fairly solidified, at least if we're looking at the next couple of years here. Obviously, it will continue to evolve. Democrats have been interested in Texas and Florida for a long time. For obviously, to put those two in the same category is somewhat unfair, given that Democrats have won Florida in not too distant,
at least in our lifetime,
right? Yeah. And at this point, they're moving in different directions. So, for various reasons. So, Texas will always be part of the conversation for Democrats, at least further out from Election Day. But
you're more pessimistic on Florida?
Solidified.
Are you more pessimistic on Florida versus Texas if you were to pick one?
Yeah, I am. I mean, look, you had just negative trends there. I think Democrats can still win there, especially in the sort of dynamic we have now without Trump on the ballot in a midterm election. Democrats would have a chance there. In the presidential election, I think it's more challenging. It's not only just been sort of a persuasion element, and who is the Democratic standard bearer for Floridians who they look at and I identify with that party. I think that's been a challenge, but just out migration, the migration patterns have just been very difficult for Democrats, where you've had Democrats moving, especially during the pandemic, moving out of the state, and that seems to continue.
Where really Democrats are moving out and Northeast Republicans are moving in?
Yeah,
basically,
not just Northeast, but yeah, Midwest.
So if you take the 7 battleground states and you take Kamala Harris's states and you put them together, the max number of Senate seats that Democrats could win is 52. What that tells you is they've got very little margin for error if they want to be competitive in the Senate. Now, look, both parties we're so polarized. Both parties are sort of, it's very difficult to win a Senate seat these days in the other side's state, right? It's, Susan Collins and is probably the last Republican that will represent Maine, but at least for the foreseeable future, she may represent it another 6 years for all we know, but she's probably the last of her kind. So the question that Democrats have to do, they have to figure out how to at least have, I would argue, another 4 to 6 states where they can win Senate seats. Maybe they can't win it in a presidential, but they've got to be able to compete in Senate races. What are those next 4 to 6 that you think Democrats ought to be? If they want to be competitive in the Senate, they got to start prioritizing now. I've got some in my head, but I don't want to poison the conversation. So I'm curious where you go first.
Well, it's a question of if you're looking at this from a demographic and sort of political trend perspective versus, the actual opportunities in the individual candidates, right? Like we saw what happened.
You could make both, because I look at it in Ohio and I don't think there's much of a chance in Ohio, but Sherrod Brown is an overperformer. So in this specific instance, I accept the premise that Ohio this year is going to be competitive. I'm skeptical, but obviously he's been the guy won nearly 8 years ago. So
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, look, from the actual demographic trends and where states have gone under Donald Trump, like bizarrely, Utah is one of those states that stands out that has actually underperformed for Republicans. It's underperformed for Trump. It's one that has trended and actually does have somewhat favorable demographic trends. A big question that you have to ask yourself if you're trying to answer this is, where do you think Latino voters go? Obviously, Donald Trump has driven a huge overperformance with Republicans among Latino voters. Do you believe that's something that is just related to Trump? How do you see what's happening with the mass deportations and very public authoritarian acts of ICE out there? How does that impact that vote? Because in the end, again, Utah has a quick, fast-growing Latino population. Texas, obviously, is a big part of that conversation and will be tested again next year in terms of where we are. But again, if you look at opportunities, I agree. Ohio, just from Sherrod Brown as someone who is a performer there, with a much more hostile environment for Republicans and Donald Trump not on the ballot, you have to believe he has a very good chance to win there. But look, you're right. I mean, the number of opportunities for Democrats above and beyond those states that Vice President Harris won, or those swing states, they're few and far between. Again, that's where you have to look at things like what happened in Nebraska, where you had Osborne running as an independent.
Is that a better strategy? I mean, you look at the plain states, right? You look at the northern tier, where it wasn't that long ago where you had 2 Democratic senators from North Dakota, for a brief period, for a reasonable period of time, 2 Democratic senators from South Dakota, 2 Democratic senators in Montana. Is that lost for a generation, or is it a Democratic brand issue, or is it an issue? Is it like a specific issue that Democrats have in those states?
I don't know. I think we'll get a good sense of that next year. The question is, can Democrats recruit and run populist candidates who are not connected to the negative brand of the party? Obviously, the brand of the party, of the Democratic Party, is not going to turn around anytime soon in those states. But to your point, Democrats have had great success in the last 2 decades in those states running.
Well, they're populist states.
That's right.
They're populist before their DNR. That's right. And that's that's why I assume they're still potentially in play, because they're not settled. They're culturally conservative, but they want an activist government. Those states benefit from an activist government.
Well, and right now they're not benefiting from the activism of the current government. When you look at what is happening, you can throw Iowa in there too. When you look at what's happening with soybean, with the tariffs, and how negatively impacted these populations have been under this presidency, and then not just the tariffs, obviously, just the federal grants for farms and that sort of thing. It's had an overwhelmingly negative impact. And so for Democrats to test this, they're going to need to run candidates who can run on that populist message, who have some credibility in that perspective. And obviously will rely on this still being forefront in their minds, and Trump and not doing a turnaround in the next couple of years here.
Some of this, sometimes you got to do triage. What blue states, the thing that made the popular vote go Trump's direction was not the 7 battleground states. It was the fact that Illinois, New Jersey, right, were 4-point races, 5-point races. You're like, whoa, right? Of the blue states, where should the party be? Hey, don't drop the ball here. I've always said New Jersey to me is at the top of the list, but what after I assume you agree on New Jersey. Where else would you be telling the party, hey, you better keep a better eye out on here, and you better do a little more work?
Well, to me, this is an interesting dynamic, because it illuminates the problem with, I think where the party brand identity issue that we've been talking about actually has a bigger impact is in these states, because I mentioned how when you look at the turnout data in 2024 relative to 2020, in the battleground states, there was almost no difference between those. Right. It was minimal, but
no difference in 3 straight elections, right?
That's right.
16, 20, and 24. They were almost more the same than different, those 7 states. Yeah.
But where the turnout truly cratered for Democrats was in these blue states, and especially these northeastern and mid-Atlantic states, where Democratic turnout was just abysmal. New Jersey actually had a little bit of both, where it had a cratering of Democratic turnout, and it also had these unaffiliated voters who were more fiscally sensitive in New Jersey than probably any other state. A lot of that just due to property taxes.
Sure.
But that drove the massive underperformance of Vice President Harris in those states. And so, I don't look at any of those at this point and say Republicans are poised to turn this into a longer term trend.
Sure.
Mobilization worries me less than persuasion, because mobilization is something that can be fixed with a single campaign and a single cycle. Persuasion can as well, but it's tougher. And so, again, it's not to say that Republicans won't have opportunities in these states, but if we're looking at it now holistically, there's not a blue state that I look at and say, well, gosh, this is one where we're certainly going to be in trouble. And other than sort of generically, again, if we want to look at where there potential liability from Democratic brand identity issues, it's going to be universally across these states.
Two of the battleground states where Democrats have had an enormous amount of success in are Georgia and Arizona. These are two states that Barack Obama could never carry. He'd come close. He'd make them more competitive. But there were, couldn't win any races in those states. Are they just uniquely allergic to Trump? Is this the suburban switch? And those two states with just, I always said Phoenix is America's largest suburb, right? And Atlanta, arguably a close second. They're just two. Is it due to the suburban shift to the Democrats that those two states in particular basically went from red to battleground?
There's a few dynamics at play in both of those states. Certainly that suburban shift is a big part of it. They just have a fairly significant, well-educated white voter population, these voters who have swung since Trump emerged onto the scene towards Democrats. And so that's a big part of it. Another thing is Asian American voters, API voters in Georgia, massively fast growing share of the electorate there. Just when you look at the difference between 2016 and 2020, where Hillary Clinton lost the state and Joe Biden won it, that margin swing was almost entirely defined just by not just population growth, but turnout growth among AAPI voters. Now, it's worth noting these same AAPI voters swung towards Trump in 2024, and then the polls are now swinging back against him. So perhaps an emerging swing group. There's not as many of those AAPI voters in Arizona as there are in Georgia, but still an insignificant element. And then I think in terms of Latino voters, Trump didn't get the same sort of swing from Latino voters in those states as he got in some other states like Nevada and Texas, Florida. And so that's part of the recipe as well.
I mean, not to oversimplify this, but what you're describing in both and what you see in, I just feel like that Latino voters, the Democrats assumed that Obama's percentage was their percentage. When you look at these first gen and second gen voters, they're just more they're economically sensitive. Well, and to me, they behave just like regular old swing voters, because swing voters are usually economically sensitive.
That's right. And that's where I think that, the pandemic had a huge impact. It's why you saw some of these bigger swings in the Rio Grande Valley, is because the way that especially the hospitality industry was hit by the pandemic in the closures. These are Hispanic voters they very much meet the profile of swing voters. I do think you're seeing that acknowledged by these campaigns now, where, I think for a while Democrats were perhaps making the mistake of treating Hispanic voters as if they were only mobilization targets and the price. And
frankly, talking the wrong issue.
That's right.
Immigration was not the number one issue among these voters.
Not at all.
4 years ago, I operated on the thesis that Trump was a temporary brand for the Republicans, and that when the quote unquote Chamber of Commerce brand came back, it would bring us to, I always said Colorado and Virginia. You look at a Glenn Youngkin, you're like, a Glenn Youngkin can succeed in both a Colorado and a Virginia, right? The sort of the Chamber of Commerce type pitch. I'm less sure now. I mean, I think I think once you have a second term, that it probably defines that Trump's now it's Trump's party. He's not borrowing the party anymore, right? He has molded the party. is that wing of the party just dormant, dead, no longer registered Republicans? I mean, the Paul Ryan wing, are they now registering as independent?
I think it's a big question of to what extent Republicans who are not Trump are able to pull off a convincing enough impersonation of him to be able to have electoral success. Because I agree. I don't see a world where the party goes back to where they were before.
Not right away. I mean, you're certainly not, it's going to take an election cycle or two before they would.
It'll take them losing badly in enough elections with not convincing enough Trump-like clone. Mm-hmm. When you look at 2022, perhaps that is indicative of how the party could free itself of Trump's shadow, in that you had a lot of Republican candidates for the Senate who are running as Trump clones, whether it was Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. Right. You go across these races that they should have won based on the history of midterm elections.
Sure.
Democratic president who was historically unpopular. They should have won them, but they didn't win them because of these candidates. Herschel Walker being another one. Arizona, and all races that they should have won, and they didn't. So post-Trump, are they able to find candidates who can pull off more convincing impersonations? Then I think it's stickier, because from a primary perspective, it's the way you win a Republican primary now, and I don't expect that to change.
Not anytime soon.
Can they win general elections without someone named Donald Trump on the ballot with that MAGA mentality? I'm just not so sure.
All right, with the last minute or two here, polling. I'm generally bullish on polling, meaning I kind of think that people I hate the averaging of polls, because I think it's created the illusion of accuracy when a poll is there to essentially give you an estimate. And it's, if you just pay attention to margins of error, polling has been fine over the last 10 years. The problem is we have this, Real Clear Politics and 538 gave us the somehow the illusion that there was pure accuracy in what was a frickin' survey. Okay. So that would drive me bonkers. And that's why I hate poll averaging and all of those things. All that said, what's your preferred methodology to get these days in order to feel like you've got a good handle on public opinion research? What kind of methodology are you looking for these days compared to, say, 20 years ago?
Well, and I agree with everything you said in terms of the state of polling, and I think pollsters should be applauded because they've adapted and evolved quite admirably.
I agree. It's hard. It's never been harder.
No, it's never been harder, and it just keeps getting harder. Apple putting in to place another update that'll make things even harder for pollsters, because the call will just be funneled right to junk folders. So, what I look for, mixed mode survey data collection is incredibly important now. I think it's one of the things that we learned, and again, I think most pollsters are doing a great job. So let's
put that in a little bit of American for people. Mixed mode, for those that don't follow the industry, means what?
So that means they're collecting data by not just one method. So they're texting people, they're doing online surveys, they're calling people, they're calling their landline. Some people still answer landlines.
They're almost picking a mode based on the demographic preference, right? If younger people prefer text to web, then you text to web everybody under the age of 30, right? And landlines over the age of 70, et cetera, right?
Every mode has its bias. And so if you can collect data through multiple modes, it gets more expensive, but you look at most accurate pollsters, that's what they're doing at this point. And I think you're just going to see more of that going forward. I will say, the other thing that drives me crazy with the polling beyond the averaging of polls is the crosstab diving.
Oh my God, that's it. That's worse, right? Like, oh, don't do that.
But we'll see movement among independent white women in one state between one poll and another, and then write a front page story about how they moved. And the reality is, none of that has the level of fidelity that we could, provide that level of credibility.
We used to have a rule, the NBC News poll, and NBC Wall Street Journal poll, and Hart, Mack, and Turf were both like this: 2 polls in a row in a subgroup. Don't go crazy when you see a switch. 2 polls in a row. And that was always the rule. We did not ever write about a swing until we saw 2 polls in a row. Even then, you're talking about a subset of 80 to 120. on some of these demographic crosstabs. But anyway,
only everyone would follow your lead on that.
Fair enough. And let me get you out in here on this. What's the nonpartisan polls that you're like, when they come out, I read it all. I read all of it. I go into the demos and everything. Who are they?
What's funny is I have spent less and less time this year digging into the polls, which I think has been healthy for me. But look, I love the New York Times polls. I don't love how people sometimes cover them or how they digest them, but I think they do an incredible job.
I love their transparency.
That's right.
I mean, their analysis it's funny how a couple of times they've literally been your poll told you the answer and you didn't write it. But anyway, I agree. Their transparency I should be commended.
I've mentioned the Navigator surveys. I think they do a great job. Beyond that, I think we get a little bit too obsessed about who was the accurate pollster last time. You have a whole bunch of pollsters who tend to have outcomes that are more Republican. You have some that are reliably more Democratic. And if the election swings one way, then those pollsters look good. And if it swings the other way, those look good. And I think we need to.
I just want consistency. Like, I know Quinnipiac's consistent. I think they have a bit of a lean. They're consistent. Emerson, I think they have a bit of a lean, but it's consistent. Like, as long as it's consistent, then I do my own math. All right, I'm going to add 2 or I'm going to subtract 2 or whatever it is. And that's where I go. But that's usually, I'm sure, what you look for, consistency.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You need to be able to make some of your own mental adjustments and calculations for sure.
Yeah. Tom Bonier, this was, appreciate you geeking out with me. And we'll see how the vote. Do you see evidence that the party is throwing real energy in voter registration yet or not?
Well, you're seeing it, and again, you're seeing more of these outside groups that have existed that had success last time around are doing it too. In terms of party doing partisan registration, I will say I've heard a lot more talk about that happening, a lot more people pushing for that happening. I believe you will see investment from the party in that as we get into the midterm elections next year.
Yeah, I'd imagine they want to show something on that front. That's for sure. Tom, appreciate the time. Great to talk with you.
Thank you.